Hi, everyone. In a recent workshop I was doing with frontline and management leaders in the immigrant and refugee serving sector, I wanted to check some assumptions about technology and technology use and knowledge mobilization in our sector, because I find this comes up fairly often in conversations and in sessions with people where we have a lot of anecdotes about, my experience has been this, of newcomers using technology or of the sector, and there's a lot of data that sometimes gets lost in those conversations, in particular because when we talk about our experiences, we're talking about serving newcomers who have accessed formal services. And so that neglects potentially a whole group of newcomers who don't access services. And we know that they're quite significant in some cases. And there's lots of nuances in this conversation. So what I did was, using Mentimeter, was I wanted to kind of get a sense of how true people felt or false people felt certain statements were, and then how certain they were of that truth or that statement being false. So what you see here is just the what they saw. This is the participant facing. So basically, I had a question with two elements. So basically, in this case, we have communities of practice or places to get to share information in our sector. So how true on a scale of 1 to 5 did they think this, or how false did they think it was? And then how certain were they of their opinion, of their idea? And I don't know how scientific this might be, but I just thought it would be interesting to find out not just what they thought, but how certain they thought they were. And so there were 7 questions, and what we ended up with was a really interesting scale. And as you can see in the middle, we've got certainty, false and true on the left and right hand side of the scale, and certain and uncertain on the top. And on the right are the 7 questions or the 7 statements that we went over. And we had 29 people participate in this particular session, and they all answered this. And so what you'll see is a really interesting plotting of points. So, for example, we have the communities of practice. Number 1, we have the communities of practice or places to get and or share information in our sector. And most people thought that was fairly true, and they were somewhat certain of that truth. Now, what's interesting, and I'll go through each one of these in depth, and there's a blog post. If you're on YouTube, there'll be a link in the description to the post, and if you're on the blog post below this video where it's embedded, I have where I assert whether I think or whether the data tells us whether this is true or false, and how certain we can be about that. And as we'll see, there's plenty of nuance. But what was interesting here, and I didn't know this would happen with this particular tool, but as we were looking at the information, and which is why I wanted to create a video of it, is that when you mouse over these questions, so for example, number 1, we have the communities of practice, you start to see actually where every individual voted. And you'll see what's consistent in all of these, and I'll go through each of the 7, is that it's quite a diverse variety of opinions about whether something is true or false and how certain people are. So for example, here, lots of people on the top right quadrant, we would see that people think this is, very true. So the very, very top right shows us someone who thinks it's absolutely true and they're absolutely certain. And then you sort of start to move down. Some people think it's true, but they're not necessarily totally certain. And then there are others who think it's false, and they're certain or uncertain of that. And a lot of people believed that it was true, but they were not certain necessarily. And again, that's really interesting. It's like, I think this is true, but I'm not sure how true it is. And I think that's a really interesting conversation for us to have in the sector. So, do we have the communities of practice or places where we can share information in the sector? So the answer is demonstrably yes, but the fact that people are not certain is interesting. It means we're not getting the word out necessarily. And the next one, number 2, every frontline worker is now a digital navigator or champion, and it's part of all of our jobs now. Somewhat true, somewhat certain. And again, huge diversity. Some people were very certain that this is false, and some people were uncertain that it was true or false. A lot of people think it's true, and the level of certainty really ranges there. And so, these are new titles possibly, but we've been talking about them during the pandemic as something that has emerged. And so, yes, obviously, more information and descriptions would be useful, but Digital Navigator is an actual model out of the States, and Digital Champions is something out of the UK. And these are actual roles, sometimes voluntary, but they're also paid roles. But increasingly, we are all, in the same way that settlement workers are systems navigators for newcomers, you're also becoming inherently digital navigators. And so it's interesting to see, again, where people land on that. For the third one, we want to share, and we will share, collaborate, and network if we had the space for it. Kind of related to number 1. And so we can see, for example, people weren't necessarily sure if we had the spaces, but if they do exist, that we want to and we will share in those spaces. And very, very high level of people thinking it's true and quite certain. And the reality is that it's not that simple. As I'll describe in the blog post, we do want to share and we will collaborate when we're brought together. But even if the space exists, it's not necessarily just the space alone that creates that. It requires facilitation. It requires us to have a reason to come together, and there's a lot of things below the iceberg that stop people from collaborating. For example, if they feel the funders in the room, they might be less honest. If English is not their first language, they might be more intimidated in opening up in a meeting. If they're frontline and there's managers in the room and they're used to more toxic work environment, they may not be as open. There's a lot. If it's anonymous versus not anonymous. So, for example, this is a good example of an anonymous approach to getting some information. But if they feel like they're at risk of being identified and they want to say something critical and that might blow back on them, they may not. So there's a lot of interesting stuff about we want to do this stuff. And then there's the whole factoring in the reality, and we saw this a lot in some of the consulting we've done on some of the recent reports, that people just don't have the time. They're not given the time. It's something that happens on the side of the desk. So yeah, I want to collaborate, but I don't know how to share it. I don't even know how to value what I'm doing and seeing that it might be of interest to someone else. And even if I do all of those things, I want to, and I believe it's useful, how do I do that? How do I write it up? How do I share it? How do I create a video of it? And where do I spend the time? And the other thing we talked about, because this is becoming really important, is questioning who should take the lead when it comes to digital and hybrid service delivery. So I may not have introduced this at the beginning. This whole conversation was predicated on talking about hybrid service delivery and how it's evolving in our sector. Should we be waiting? So this was a local regional group that came together. And so I agree with this. It's false. We should not be waiting for not networks above us to lead us on this. We should be leading as well. Interestingly, though, still some people who believe this to be true, and that is important to have that nuance, right? And some people were less certain than others about this question. But really, I agree, and I think the data shows us is that the reality is that it's really the local and the regional that will filter up to the provincial and national networks to lead us on hybrid service delivery. There is so much to learn from the work that's being done at the local level by individual organizations, and we really need to convene those conversations, but figure out ways to move them up and demand what we need, not just wait to be led. Professional development is hard to access. So number 5, you can see people think that's somewhat false, but they're not completely, and they're slightly certain. Right, so again, really interesting mix. Some people absolutely, this is false, absolutely certain that it's false, and a bunch of people who are uncertain, who are less certain, but still think it's a false statement, and a bunch of people who think it's true in varying degrees of certainty. So again, the reality here is that what do we mean by hard to access, right? There's tons of places where you can do learning. The question sometimes is it free? Is it affordable? Can I pay for it? Is there a budget for it? Will I have work time to do it? Do I have to do this on my own time? Do I have to use my own money? And what professional development should I actually be accessing? These are some of the questions below the iceberg with something like this, right? I'm not sure what's the right course, program, certificate that I need in order to further the work that I'm doing. Really important to sort of hash that out as well. But again, interesting to see the diversity of opinions here. So hybrid service delivery is either or, so it's either in person or it's digital and online. And this is an important conversation for us to be having because we are defining what hybrid service delivery is. And so people think this is a thought overall that this was a true statement, although at least one person was like, that's false and I'm not really certain about it, and a few people, that's absolutely false and I'm completely certain, whereas a bunch of people where it's true and I'm absolutely certain. And the reality is hybrid service delivery is what I would call both and, right? It's both in person and digital or online. The idea that a person can move between modalities of service. So one day I might come in person, the next day I might access your services online, and creating a hybrid really talks about creating a no wrong door approach to accessing service delivery and being able to move between those modalities. But again, the diversity of opinion here is really, really interesting to see. A lot of certainty in whether it's true or false, and quite a mix. So what we end up with, again, a point that says somewhat true, probably like somewhat true, fairly certain, but when you sort of tease out the points, it's interesting to see that there's a lot of pull in different directions here. And then the final one, newcomers are more digitally literate than you are, and you are meaning sector organizations in this case. And people decided this was false, although they weren't completely, somewhat false, and they're not really that certain about that. Although, again, the very diverse set of points here. And so, again, in the post below, I'll show how this is a demonstrably false statement. True statement. Newcomers are more digitally literate than our service organizations, but also that there's an incredible amount of nuance, right? If we've learned anything over the pandemic, is that the depth and the nuance of the digital divide amongst newcomer communities, but we've also learned about the strengths. The reality is, and I'll show, and I'll link in the thing, that there's in the post, there's tons of data to show us that this is demonstrably true. They're just digitally literate in different ways. So one of the things that comes up a lot in these conversations is newcomers can't access our services because they only have phones, and our services require at least a computer or a laptop, sometimes a tablet, a bigger screen, a non-mobile environment, and that is a barrier, except it's a fabricated barrier. That means that's what we're doing isn't newcomer centric enough. And what I mean by that is that if we know that people are using smartphones, we need to be building solutions that are smartphone or mobile friendly. And so you can say that a newcomer might be less digitally literate because they don't know how to use a computer, but they're completely proficient at using their smartphone. And again, there's tons of nuances when we look at digital literacy and the digital divide, access not just to devices in terms of real actual devices, but also what does that look like in someone's home? Maybe the device is there and they have the internet connectivity, but the device is controlled or used by one or two people in the family, and others don't have access to it. And that's a question. So lots of stuff that we've learned here, and I really find this is maybe checking the pulse of our sector is so important at different times, but also to see the diversity of understandings and opinions and assumptions on some of these questions. And I think we need to do more of this kind of checking in with each other to really kind of get a sense of where we're at and how we can address whether they're myths or assumptions, and make sure that we're all on the same page when it comes to this information.